Ever wondered what cavemen actually did all day? Like, did they just grunt, throw spears, and nap in caves? Or was there a bit more to it? In this video, we're taking a slow, sleepy walk through prehistoric life, from waking up next to a mammoth skin blanket to figuring out what counts as dinner when everything wants to eat you back. But before you get too comfortable, make sure you've hit that subscribe button and drop your city name and local time in the comments so we know where in the world you're watching from. Long before alarm clock sunlight, tapping at the cracks of a cave mouth was the original wake-up call. No snooze button, no soft music, just light smoke and maybe the sound of someone sneezing into a pile of moss. For cavemen, mornings weren't filled with emails or to-do lists. Instead, they started with the most basic question: am I still alive? If the answer was yes, no bear attacks, no falling rocks in the night, then it was time to begin the prehistoric version of a routine. Imagine a man stirring under a bundle of animal skins, hair tangled and stiff nose, cold back sore from the uneven stone beneath. He squints at the dim light creeping into the cave and lets out a grunt, a sound that could mean good morning, where's breakfast, or simply ooh. Beside him, a few family members are still snoring, and not far away, someone's child is chewing on a stick like it's a pacifier. This is not the dawn of civilization. This is just dawn, messy, smelly, and cold. There was no such thing as personal space. Families, sometimes several generations, slept huddled together for warmth, bodies curled like comma shapes, tangled in old furs, backs pressed tight against one another, and yes, someone always snored. Fact, snoring might have been one of humanity's earliest lullabies, rhythmic, guttural, and oddly comforting if you were used to it. If you weren't, well, tough luck. The fire in the center of the cave, now just glowing coals, offered some warmth and a little smoke to chase off insects and bad spirits, or at least that's what they believed. First task of the day: check the fire. A caveman's worst morning wasn't waking up late. It was waking up to a dead fire. Fire was precious. It meant warmth, safety, and cooked food, if they were lucky enough to have someone. Usually the person who drew the short stick, or was lowest in the social pecking order, would be poking the embers, adding dry moss or bits of bark to get it going again. All of this done while shivering barefoot and still half asleep. There was no bathroom, of course. The morning walk to relieve oneself wasn't a pleasant stroll through nature. It was a cold and cautious shuffle into the wilderness. Every step had to be calculated. A rustle in the bushes might be wind, or it might be something that wanted to eat you. No one dawdled. You did your business quickly and got back before your toes froze off. Hygiene was, well, primitive. Water was icy, and soap hadn't even been dreamed up yet. If they got muddy, they stayed muddy until the next rainstorm or river bath, whichever came first. Once everyone was up, the cave began to hum with activity. Kids jabbered in simple, rough sounds, mimicking their parents or poking sticks into the fire for fun. Adults stretched cracked joints, scratched fleas, and exchanged grunts of greeting. The elders, if they lived long enough to be elders, might already be sitting by the fire, staring into it with the patience of someone who had survived way too many winters and knew better than to rush the day breakfast. That was a gamble. There was no pantry, no grain silo, no leftovers in the fridge. Most mornings began with not eating. If someone had been lucky enough to trap a rabbit the day before, or if there were some dried berries stashed under a rock, it was a feast. Otherwise, people chewed on roots or gnawed old bones for marrow. Hunger wasn't an emergency. It was just part of the routine. Your stomach grumbled, and you ignored it until the sun got higher and hunting began. Clothing was another concern. There were no wardrobes, just a pile of furs and hides that were more practical than fashionable. These clothes stank. They were stiff with old sweat, rain, and smoke, but they kept the body warm, and that was all that mattered. Slipping into your fur leggings and draping a skin over your shoulders was the caveman version of getting dressed for work. Minus the tie plus the occasional tick if it was winter. Everything took twice as long. Fingers moved slower. Breath fogged the air. Icicles might hang from the edge of the cave. The fire had to be fed constantly, and food was harder to find. But in summer things worked much better. Bugs bit, heat stung, and fresh kills spoiled fast. There was never a truly easy season. Only different types of difficulty cave interiors were not decorated like in movies. Most of the wall art we know about was likely ceremonial, not casual doodles. Daily life happened in the messiest parts of the cave, animal bones scattered around stone tools, half buried in dirt baskets of twigs and moss, laid out to dry, a mix of smoke, sweat, and damp rock made up the signature cave scent. No candle company would dare bottle it. Conversations, such as they were, relied on gestures, facial expressions, and basic vocal sounds. Language was in its early stages. Maybe it was a series of grunts. Maybe some had names for things like fire, wolf, or you again. But it was simple and to the point. If you wanted someone to hand you a rock, you pointed and made a noise that suggested urgency. If they didn't respond, you threw the rock yourself. Communication wasn't poetic, but it got the job done. Social structures were loose, but still there. Some people hunted better, some made better tools, some were good at remembering where the berries grew. These skills earned respect and a bit more food. Leadership didn't involve speeches or crowns, but a good decision-maker could become the unofficial guide for the group. Until, of course, they made a bad call. Then someone else stepped in. Survival didn't care about popularity. As the morning wore on, the group slowly began to split into roles. Hunters gathered spears and checked their stone tips. Gatherers looked toward the forest, already discussing, in their limited way, where to find nuts or roots. Some stayed behind to tend the fire or guard the children, especially if wolves had been sniffing around recently. It was a team effort always. Through all of this, there was a strange kind of calm. Life was hard, yes, but it was clear. There were no distractions, no clocks ticking, no decisions about what shoes to wear. You woke up, you survived, you worked, you hoped the day didn't end with a broken leg or an empty stomach. And then, if you were lucky, you fell asleep beside the fire again, ready to start all over. Caveman mornings were not glamorous, but they were honest, stripped down to the basics of human existence. Cold rock under your feet, smoke in your hair, a stick in your hand, and the quiet understanding that this somehow was enough. If you think skipping breakfast today makes you cranky, imagine waking up in a world where breakfast was more of a hope than a meal. For cavemen, there was no stack of pancakes, no eggs sizzling in a pan. There wasn't even a pan. Breakfast, if it existed at all, was entirely dependent on what had survived the night. Leftovers from a kill, a forgotten handful of berries maybe, a few grubs if someone was desperate enough to dig, after the first morning grunts, and fire tending the next. Big question was, is there anything to eat? Most of the time the answer was not yet, and so began the ritual of scavenging and improvising. Those too young or too old to go on hunts would start by poking around yesterday's bones, cracking them open with a stone in hopes of a sliver of marrow. It wasn't glamorous, but it was fatty, warm, and exactly the kind of thing a body needed in a freezing world. Some mornings, if they were lucky, they might find a partially buried stash, dried meat tucked under a flat stone, or a tiny woven pouch of dried fruit and nuts hidden from scavengers and hungry relatives. These were primitive leftovers. No refrigeration, no Tupperware, just cool rock and memory. But most often, there was nothing. And so the hunger began to gnaw, slow and familiar, like a dull ache behind the ribs, while the men sharpened their spears and adjusted their fur wraps. The women and children might go foraging. Not every group functioned the same way, but in general, early, humans split their tasks by skill and necessity. Those with sharp eyes for spotting roots or bird nests took the forest paths. They walked barefoot through thickets, turning over stones and prodding the earth with sticks. The goal wasn't just food. It was edible food. Not everything in nature is safe. and even thousands of years ago. Humans knew that some berries killed, and some mushrooms made your uncle think he could fly there. Were no grocery lists, only instincts passed down from watching. Others, don't eat the red ones with bumps. These nuts are good only after the rain. That leafy thing made Grandma sick once, never again. Food knowledge wasn't written down. It was burned into memory, reinforced by trial error. And sometimes tragedy in spring and summer foraging could be bountiful wild berries. Tubers, nuts, seeds, the occasional honeycomb, if someone was brave or foolish enough to mess with bees. All were fair game, but in winter the earth hardened. Forests grew quiet. The sky stayed gray. Food didn't hide it, simply vanished. That's when breakfast turned into boiled bark and hollow promises. Some mornings just chewing something, even if it was fibrous and tasteless, made people feel better. Of course, there were no formal meals. No one sat around a table and asked someone to pass the salt. Eating was a practical, scattered affair. If someone found something edible, they might grunt for others to join or quietly sneak off and eat it alone, depending on their mood, relationship with the group, or sheer desperation. Sharing happened, especially among family or small bands, but it wasn't always expected. Hunger could sharpen a person's selfishness. Every now and then a rare treat would appear. Maybe someone stumbled upon an abandoned bird's nest and brought back a few raw eggs, or maybe the hunters left behind a bone with actual meat still on it. A careless oversight, quickly corrected by hungry hands. These small finds were like winning a prehistoric lottery. People would gather around, fingers, quick eyes, sharper than any knife, each one hoping for a bite. But the biggest reward, the best breakfast anyone could dream of, was honey, if someone dared to go after a wild beehive, climbing trees, or smoking out the buzzing swarm with smoldering moss, and returned with a dripping comb. They were treated like royalty for the rest of the day. Honey was rare, rich, and required more courage than most people had. Before noon, sweetness was almost unheard of in their diets, and when it arrived, even for a moment, it rewired something ancient in the brain. Cavemen didn't know the word for delicious, but they definitely felt it. For children, breakfast was even less structured. They didn't wait to be fed. They explored. Some chewed old hides out of boredom. Others chased bugs and tried to snack on them. A few wandered too far and got yelled at or grunted at by their mothers, dragged back to the safety of the group. Even toddlers learned early that food didn't come to you. You went to it. It was a hard lesson, but it made strong survivors. Closest thing to a group meal might happen around the fire if someone returned with a catch from the early morning hunt. A rabbit, a snake, maybe a fat lizard, or a couple of birds. Anything that could be skewered and roasted. The smell alone would gather people's eyes, would follow the flickering meat like it was hypnotic. And when it was done, usually charred on the outside, a little raw inside, pieces would be ripped and handed around in a silent ritual of survival. There were no utensils. Meat was eaten with hands, torn by teeth, juices dripping onto fur, wraps, and bare legs. Bones were sucked dry and tossed to the floor. Sometimes they were ground later into tools or ornaments, but in the moment, they were just leftovers in the dirt. And yes, people fought over food. Elbows were thrown, glares were exchanged. A child might lose a piece to an elder, or a younger adult might steal a chunk. While no one was looking, fairness didn't always win. Hunger did still. Even in these harsh routines, there was something deeply human about it all, eating together. Even in scraps and stolen bites, created moments of unity. It reminded the group they were still alive, still part of something beyond themselves. They had another day, another fire, another chance to find something better tomorrow as the sun rose higher. And the rumbling in their stomachs became background noise. People shifted gears. Breakfast time, or the lack of it, was over. Now came the heart of the day, tracking, chasing, crafting, surviving. The taste of a root or a burned piece of meat lingered on their tongues, a reminder that nature was stingy, and you had to earn every mouthful in the end. Breakfast for a caveman wasn't a moment. It was a mission. It was the first negotiation with nature, every single day. Sometimes you won. Most of the time you didn't. But you always tried, and that stubborn effort, that relentless search for one more bite, was what carried them forward generation after generation into the long, uncertain day ahead. Once the fire was stoked and the hunger pangs were slightly dulled, or at least ignored, the real work began. Cavemen didn't have jobs in the way we think of them now. There were no promotions, no career paths, and certainly no weekends off. But every day came with a singular purpose: find food, and don't die doing it. That was the Stone Age version of productivity. As the morning sun reached above the trees, the hunters prepared for the day. This was no dramatic tribal ceremony, no painted faces or booming drums. It was quiet, cautious, and deliberate. Tools were checked. Spears sharpened with flint stones tied tightly with strips of sinew. Small knives tucked into fur belts. Everything was handmade, crude, but effective and often little blood-stained from yesterday's use. These weren't weapons of war. They were tools of survival. The group split usually by skill and stamina. Those with sharp eyes, steady arms, and strong legs took to the open woods and rocky valleys. Hunters moved quietly, often barefoot, using gestures and simple sounds to communicate language, if it existed, wasn't full of flowery strategy. A hand signal here, a low grunt there, just enough to say, "Go left," or "Quiet now." Silence was crucial. One crack of a twig too loud, and the prey would vanish into the undergrowth like a ghost. There was no guarantee of success. Most hunts failed. Animals were fast, strong, and far more in tune with the land than humans would ever be. Deer could disappear into the trees in seconds. Wild pigs were vicious when cornered. Even small creatures like rabbits could dodge a thrown spear with humiliating ease. The hunters learned to live with disappointment. They had to. Nature wasn't kind. It was stingy, unpredictable, and often just plain rude. But when things did go right, when a group successfully brought down a gazelle, a boar, or in rare moments of miracle, something huge, like a mammoth, it was cause for celebration, not with dancing or shouting, but with quiet, breathless awe, because meat meant survival. It meant fat, protein, warmth. It meant children would sleep with full bellies and elders would get another day of life. Even the act of carrying the carcass back was sacred in its own way, heavy, grueling. Bloody work, but worth every aching muscle. Meanwhile, while the hunters vanished into the wild, the gatherers fanned out in smaller, more scattered groups. This included women, elders, children, and anyone who wasn't fast or strong enough to chase something with horns. But don't mistake this for the easy job. Foraging came with its own dangers. Snakes hiding under rocks, bees defending their hives, thorny plants ready to tear open ankles, and sometimes other hungry creatures were out gathering too. Animals with claws and teeth, who saw humans as competition, or worse, lunch gatherers, moved through the landscape like detectives, scanning the ground, sniffing the air, remembering places where fruit grew, or where a patch of edible roots had once been found. The success of a gathering trip depended on memory, observation, and sometimes luck. They might stumble across a patch of mushrooms, but were they the kind that filled your belly, or the kind that filled your brain with terrifying visions of dancing wolves? One wrong pick could end a life. They worked in silence or low murmurs, always listening. Every rustle could mean danger, every shadow a predator. But in spite of the fear, there was a strange intimacy in it. Fingers brushing through grass, dirt under the nails, the satisfaction of finding something useful in the chaos of the wild. Sometimes they returned with bulging baskets of tubers, nuts, and leaves, sometimes with barely a handful, but they always came back scratched, sore, and grateful to be breathing back in the cave. Not everyone left. Some people stayed behind, not out of laziness, but because the group needed guards, firekeepers, and caregivers. The elderly, if they were healthy enough to move, might shape tools, grind, bones or weave plant fibers into rope. Children who weren't old enough to help in the woods learned by watching, copying the motions of spear making or basket weaving with sticks and stones. Everyone had a role. Doing nothing was not an option, and through all of this, the hunting, the gathering, the fire tending, there was always one constant danger. Death wasn't rare. It lurked everywhere. A hunting trip could end with someone gored, trampled, or falling from a cliff. A simple walk to collect berries could turn into a race for life if a bear or a big cat decided you looked easier to catch than a deer. And sometimes the weather itself was the enemy. Storms rolled in fast floods, swallowed low ground. Trees fell without warning. Nature didn't care if you had plans. Injuries were brutal. There were no bandages, no antibiotics, no painkillers, beyond chewing on certain leaves or biting a stick until your teeth cracked. A twisted ankle could mean being left behind. A deep cut might kill you slowly, and infections were silent, creeping deaths. Wounds that looked small but swelled and burned, and days later took a person in their sleep. The group mourned, of course, but mourning was short. Survival moved quickly. There was always more to do. Sometimes they encountered other groups, strangers, other humans. Were always a gamble. Sometimes there was sharing, a gesture of peace, a shared fire, even some trading of food or tools. But other times, meetings turned violent. Territory was precious. Water sources, hunting trails, caves with dry ceilings. All of these were worth fighting for. And in a world without rules, strength often decided what was right. But not everything was grim. There were rare, beautiful moments. A quiet stretch of woods filled with fruit. A successful hunt that brought back more meat than expected. A day with no injuries, no storms, no growls in the night. These moments felt like miracles. They were talked about, remembered, past down. They were proof that life, though hard, could sometimes be good. At the end of a long day, everyone, hunters, gatherers, guards, and elders, returned to the fire. They brought with them blood, bruises, stories, and hopefully food. The fire was stoked, meat sizzled, roots were boiled, and people, exhausted but alive, ate together. There was laughter in its own raw form. Someone mimicked a deer slipping on a rock. Someone teased the young boy who fell into a patch of thorns. Jokes didn't need words. A raised eyebrow, a mock growl, a wide-eyed stare. It was enough. Didn't know it, but these simple, painful, glorious routines, hunting, gathering, and narrowly avoiding death, were the foundation of humanity. Every scar was a lesson. Every belly filled was a victory. Every night survived was another step forward toward a future none of them could imagine. When people think of cavemen, they often imagine someone dumb, hairy, and grunting over a rock like it's the height of technology. But that image doesn't give early humans nearly enough credit. These people weren't stupid. Far from it. They were clever in the most essential way. They solved problems with whatever they had in the middle of nowhere, with no help, no instructions, and no second chances. Start with tools. The original caveman apps. Long before screwdrivers or scissors, the very first tools were basic. A sharp stone, a long stick, maybe a piece of bone with a decent point on it. But even these simple objects were life-changing. A sharp stone could slice meat, cut hide, or shave wood into something more useful. And when someone figured out that banging two stones together could make a sharp edge, that was a game changer. The prehistoric equivalent of discovering fire. Again, toolmaking was a mix of instinct and experimentation. A caveman might spend half the day testing rocks by smashing them against others, searching for one that broke just right. Not too crumbly, not too smooth. The perfect flint had to chip into a jagged, dangerous shape, the kind that could pierce an animal's hide or a vent. Rival's skull, once shaped, that stone edge might be tied to a wooden shaft with strips of rawhide or plant fiber, creating a primitive but effective spear, axe, or knife. And when that tool finally worked, when it sliced through bark or meat or bone, you can bet someone grunted with pride. These weren't one-off discoveries either. Over time, better tools meant better chances at survival. The spear helped with hunting. The scraper helped with skinning. A flat rock became a hammer, and even bones, once just leftovers, were turned into needles, fishhooks, and tiny chisels. People didn't just use nature. They reshaped it. They became creators, not just survivors. And then there was fire, the crown jewel of early human discovery. Tools were the caveman's hands, fire was their heart. It was warmth, light, safety, and food, all in one. And unlike animals who feared fire, humans learned to tame it. Well, sometimes. Most of the time, fire was still temperamental, difficult, and stubborn. As a wild beast, but when it worked, when a spark turned into a flame, it was almost holy. No one knows exactly how fire was first discovered. Maybe lightning struck a dry tree, and someone got curious instead of running. Maybe two stones accidentally sparked, or maybe a stick rubbed against another just right. However it happened, once humans figured out how to create fire on purpose, everything changed. A fire wasn't easy. There were no matches, no lighters, no magic spell. It required patience, skill, and dry materials. Dry being the key word. Wet moss, damp bark, or humid air could ruin everything. A common method was the bow drill, a curved stick strung with cord, spun back and forth to twist another stick against a flat piece of wood until smoke appeared. Not a beginner-friendly process, and certainly not fun in the rain once. Lit fires had to be protected like newborns. If it died, the whole group suffered. People took turns watching it, feeding it twigs, fanning it gently, or shielding it with their own bodies in harsh winds. Firekeepers were respected, even if their job looked boring. After all, their hands held life itself. Cooking with fire brought new flavors and fewer parasites. Meat could be roasted instead of eaten raw. Roots could be softened. Tough plants became edible. Food lasted longer, and injuries healed faster, thanks to heated water and smoke-cleaned wounds. Fire even changed the way people thought. It extended the day around the glow of a campfire. The world didn't stop at sunset. People could sit, share, rest, talk, even tell stories. Yes, stories. Cavemen might not have had full languages, but they definitely had stories. You don't need grammar to tell a tale. A few gestures, a dramatic growl, a wild arm motion showing how big the bear was. That's enough to make everyone lean in around. The fire storytelling was education, entertainment, warning, and pride, all rolled into one. This is how I survived. That is where the river runs. Here is why we don't go near the Black Cave. Memory passed down not with books, but with flame-lit faces and dramatic retellings. Fire also shaped community. It created a center, a place where people gathered, huddled, and became more than just individuals. It brought warmth, not just to skin, but to relationships around it. Children played with sticks, couples shared scraps. Elders mumbled advice that no one asked for, but everyone listened to. And when the fire crackled, just right, sending sparks into the night air, it felt like the world was talking back. But not everything was a glowing success. Cleverness had limits. Sometimes a tool broke mid-hunt, and someone ended up bruised or worse. Sometimes the fire wouldn't start, and people froze through the night. Sometimes an experiment with a weird plant turned into a full-body rash. Trial and error was the only way forward. Heavy on the error, still humans persisted. They improved, they observed, they remembered. If one kind of tree made better spears, they returned to it. If a rock shattered too easily, they stopped using it. If a certain kind of bark smoked too much and made their eyes sting, they threw it into the river. Every mistake was a lesson carved into muscle memory. Every improvement, no matter how small, was shared, even if just by pointing and grunting in the right direction. Cleverness wasn't limited to tools or fire. It showed up in the smallest details of daily life. Someone figured out how to carry water in a hollow gourd. Someone else learned to dry meat by hanging it near smoke. Maybe someone tied a rope to a stick and accidentally invented a fishing line. Innovation didn't come in lightning bolts. It came in slow, clumsy stumbles forward. Even Play had its place. Children mimicked their parents by shaping stones, dragging sticks, pretending to hunt lizards, or build tiny fires. This wasn't just fun, it was training. And sometimes in their games, kids stumbled upon ideas that even the adults hadn't thought of. A new way to chip stone, a faster knot, a smoother throw. That was the genius of cavemen. They learned by doing, and they never stopped doing. They didn't have science, but they had curiosity. They didn't have books, but they had observation, and even in the middle of a world that wanted to kill them, frostbite, famine, fangs, and all, they figured things out slowly, painfully, brilliantly. So, no cavemen were dumb brutes grunting in the dark. They were inventors, problem solvers, and fire makers. They were the first engineers, artists, and teachers. They turned bones into tools, sticks into spears, and darkness into warmth. They didn't just survive their world, they changed it. And as the fire crackled each night, with tools laid beside sleeping bodies and minds, quietly replaying the day's small victories, they dreamed of more than just tomorrow. They dreamed of better. They just didn't have a word for it yet. As the sun dipped below the trees and the world darkened into silence, the cave came alive in a different way. The frantic pace of the hunt slowed. The endless search for roots and berries ended, and in their place came something more human. Something quieter, slower, and strangely familiar. The gentle chaos of cave gossip and the evening rituals that helped early humans wind down from a day of just barely not dying. Nighttime in the Stone Age didn't mean rest, not immediately anyway. It meant transition. One moment people were sharpening spears and dodging wild animals. The next they were gathered around the fire, picking grit from between their toes, scratching bites and grumbling about how sore their backs were. There were no beds to flop into, no pajamas to change into, no phones to scroll. The evening routine was built around flickering light, muscle fatigue, and the undeniable need to complain just a little before sleeping. This was the time when the day's unspoken tension finally unraveled. There was no official news, but updates rippled through the group like smoke. Someone would grunt about a near miss with a wild boar. Another would mime how a bird snatched a fruit right out of their hands. Kids chimed in with their own exaggerated tales, arms waving wildly as they reenacted falling into a bush or poking a frog with a stick. No one needed a common language to tell a story. Faces, hands, and tone did most of the work. And yes, there was gossip. Absolutely. You don't need words like scandal or drama to know that humans love to talk about each other. Even in caves, social lives mattered. Who ate more than their share? Who snuck off with a piece of meat? Who's been making eyes at someone across the fire? These things got noticed. A raised eyebrow, a mocking grunt, or a not-so-subtle glance was enough to send a message. Elders, especially those too old to hunt or gather, were often the evening's entertainment. They'd sit near the fire, their leathery hands tracing patterns in the dirt, retelling ancient tales with low, gravelly voices and dramatic pauses. These weren't bedtime stories. They were warnings wrapped in drama. Don't go past the river. That's where the spirit of the cave lion lives. Once your grandfather killed a snake so big it swallowed a wolf. Probably not true. But then again, maybe it was. Who was going to fact-check? Sometimes these tales explained the world around them. Why the moon followed them at night. Why the thunder rumbled. Why fire hurt when touched. It didn't matter if the logic held up. What mattered was meaning. These stories gave shape to an otherwise confusing and brutal world, and they gave the group something to hold on to when the darkness outside grew deep and strange. But not everyone sat by the fire. Some kept working even in the low light. A mother might patch together a fur wrap using a bone needle and thread made from sinew. A young man might sharpen his spear over and over, not out of necessity, but out of habit or nerves. Someone else might be braiding thin vines into rope, their fingers moving without thought, their eyes lost in the flames. And while most people huddled together for warmth, others slipped outside for privacy. Not for any deep reason, just because sometimes you needed a minute alone, even in the Stone Age. Maybe to breathe the cold air, maybe to watch the stars and wonder what those strange lights in the sky were. Maybe just to escape the smell of 20 sweaty people in one smoky cave. Speaking of which, let's talk about sleep preparation. If you can call it that. There were no pillows, no blankets, no bedtime tea. Comfort was whatever furs and moss you could pile under yourself most. People slept in clusters like a pile of laundry that had given up parents with children curled around them lovers. Tucked close elders propped against the wall like old trees refusing to fall. It wasn't elegant, but it was warm. Still, there were routines, rituals. Even the fire had to be managed. Not fed too much, or it would smoke. Not left alone, or it would die. Someone always stayed up a little later than the others feeding it, slowly watching the shadows dance along the walls. This person wasn't just a firekeeper. They were a sentinel listening for rustling in the dark, watching the cave mouth for anything that didn't belong. Sleep was a luxury. Safety came first, and yet sleep did come. Slowly, one by one, people drifted off. To the soft crackle of flames, the occasional fart, and the whispery hiss of wind outside, the cave didn't go quiet all at once. There was always some muttering, some turning over, someone coughing in the back, but eventually, even the fidgeters gave. In-dreams were part of life too, though no one had words for them. People might wake up muttering, wide-eyed from some wild vision. Maybe they dreamed of fire that floated, or animals that talked, or rivers that flew through the air. These dreams were sometimes seen as messages or warnings, or just weird things the brain did when it had too much roasted root before bed. Either way, they were remembered, shared, sometimes feared, but nighttime wasn't always peaceful. Predators roamed, and humans knew it. Every strange sound outside could be a leopard. Every breeze might carry the scent of something watching. That's why fires burned all night. That's why people slept in shifts. And that's why caves were chosen carefully, dry hard to access, and with only one or two ways in or out. Nature didn't give second chances, so early humans built caution into everything they did. Still, some nights were beautiful. The air would be still. The moonlight might bathe the cave's edge. Silver. The stars, thousands of them unpolluted by city lights, would pulse above like ancient spirits. On those nights, people didn't just survive. They existed quietly together, with full bellies or empty ones, with aches or peace. They rested in the safety of their group, and the quiet hope that tomorrow wouldn't be worse than today. The rituals of winding down, the gossip, the storytelling, the whisper of fur against stone, were more than just ways to pass time. They were the heartbeat of the group. They were the glue. In a world where every day was a fight for survival, the cave at night was where humans remembered who they were, more than just hunters, more than just gatherers. They were people, complicated, emotional, smelly, hilarious. People. And as the fire flickered low, casting soft orange onto sleeping faces and bones on the floor, the cave settled into silence. A silence broken only by breath, by dreams, and the occasional whisper of the wind reminding them morning would come soon, and with it, everything all over again. As the flickering flames of the campfire died down, casting long shadows across the cave walls, a heavy silence would fall over the Stone Age world. For the caveman, the day ended much as it began, surrounded by stone, by kin, and by the ever-present hum of survival. But the night was not just for sleep. It was for stories, for fears, for dreams, and for something close to wonder. Even in a world ruled by hunger and weather, there was still mystery. And for the early humans, that mystery came alive once the sun disappeared. Cavemen didn't have beds, but they had a kind of order to their nighttime arrangements. The elderly and the children slept closest to the warmth of the fire, curled in piles of animal furs. The strong ones, hunters, warriors, and those who wanted to feel important chose the outer edges, pretending they were guarding the cave, though they often snored loud enough to wake a bear. There was no privacy. You could hear someone's stomach growling, someone mumbling in their sleep, and someone else coughing like they were halfway to being a fossil. Before sleep settled in there was sometimes a kind of storytelling ritual. Elders or mothers would speak in hushed tones, pointing to the dancing shadows on the walls. Sometimes those shadows were turned into stories, how the great owl saved the tribe, or how the stars were once hunters themselves who rose to the sky. These weren't bedtime stories as we know them today, but they served the same purpose: to settle the mind, to explain the unexplainable, and to keep the darkness from swallowing you whole. Dreams, even back then, were puzzling things. No one understood them, but everyone had them. A caveman might wake up in the middle of the night with wide eyes, confused by the memory of running through fire or flying above the trees. No language existed to fully explain dreams, so they were expressed in grunts, dramatic gestures, or strange charcoal drawings scratched onto the stone. Were they visions, warnings, just leftover thoughts from the hunt? Nobody knew, but dreams mattered. Some believed they were messages from ancestors. Others thought they were just the brain's way of sneezing. Fear was a part of the night, real fear, not the kind you get from watching a scary movie, but the deep, ancient kind that comes from knowing a saber-toothed cat might be sniffing around the cave entrance. The wind could howl like wolves. The fire might die out. Sometimes someone had to wake up and throw another stick into the flames, muttering half-asleep curses and stepping on someone else's leg in the process. But even through the fear, there was comfort in closeness. Being part of a group meant you didn't face the dark alone. Then there were the stars. Cavemen didn't know what they were, but they watched them night after night. The stars moved, some disappeared, others returned. The moon changed shape, grew fat, then vanished. These changes were not lost on early humans. They didn't have telescopes, but they had eyes and they had time. Some of the first calendars and patterns were scratched into stone by people who simply stared at the sky and noticed things. It was their first step toward science, though they had no word for it yet. Snoring was a communal issue. With no walls, even one enthusiastic sleeper could ruin the peace of the night. Grunts, whistles, and growls echoed off the cave walls. Sometimes someone would snore so loud that they'd startle themselves awake, sit up like a meerkat, and then collapse back down in embarrassment. Sleep was never perfect. It came in chunks: first sleep, then a waking period, then second sleep. During that waking time, people might whisper, snack on leftover berries, or simply lie on their backs staring into the blackness. This broken sleep wasn't a problem. In fact, it was natural. Without artificial light, the human body slipped into a rhythm tied to darkness. That little pause in the middle of the night gave people time to think, dream, reflect, or worry about whether that strange howl was getting closer. It was a moment of pause, a mental reset. And sometimes it was in that space between sleep where real creativity happened. Cavemen weren't just brawn and bone. They had emotions, they had thoughts. And though they didn't have diaries, their walls were their journals. In those quiet moments between wake and sleep, someone might pick up a piece of burnt wood and draw something new, a creature from a dream, a new symbol, a mysterious spiral. Those marks weren't just idle doodles. They were ideas, beginnings, the first evidence that even in a world without words, people still longed to leave something behind. The fire would eventually burn low, the embers glowing like forgotten stars on the cave floor. Sleep, despite all its interruptions, came eventually. The tribe would drift off one by one, curled like commas in a sentence that hadn't finished yet, their minds filled with sounds of the day: cracking bones, rustling leaves, the slap of bare feet on cold earth. But also maybe, just maybe, they dreamt of things they had not yet seen, lands they hadn't yet wandered, to stories they hadn't yet told. Morning would come again, and with it the same scramble for warmth, the same rustle of bodies shaking off sleep, the same question, what do we eat today? But for a few brief hours in the dark beneath a sky no one understood, these early humans shared something we still cling to today: the need for rest, the mystery of dreams, and the quiet hum of existing together, even when the world outside feels wild. That's how the cavemen ended their days. Not with grand inventions or heroic speeches, but with a fire, a few furs, and the sound of snoring in the dark.